Welcome back to part 3 of the monster painting guide for Substance Painter. So we have a little egg creature that we made in ZBrush. We UV'd it, we baked it, and now it's in Substance. In the previous video, we added shadows and we also masked them using an inverted mask by using an existing mask to conceal any details that might pop through. Usually if you paint on the height map for something, it can still show through. So it's useful to create a folder, invert a mask that exists to then mask out that content so that it only shows where it's supposed to, otherwise it'll just be everywhere. So when you're painting with a mask and the layer below it has height, it'll show through. And if you don't want that to happen, use an inverted mask. In this video, we're going to be using this inverted mask still. We're going to create a new fill. So we have shadows. Now we'll do midtones. So what midtones are like, they're basically just a color that's similar to the base fill color, but it's slightly different. It can be lighter or darker just to add some more like visual variety. Generally, midtones are just like kind of the point between highlights and shadows. In this case, we're going to add a little hint of color here. So one thing we actually could do instead, let's delete midtones. Let's just copy and paste inside, put it above shadows so it renders first, rename this to midtones. And then we will change the color to be a little orange and slightly brighter. And then we're going to right click on that, add a black mask, and then you can also turn off the roughness. So right now this does nothing, and we can click on the mask to begin painting on the mask. You can pull up your shelf. You can always access your shelf from Window, Views, Shelf, and then go to the brushes setting. In this case, I'm going to be using the bark brush. Actually, let's use a different brush for the midtones because we used the bark brush for the shadows. So let's do something a little slightly different. We could use noise like Artistic Soft. That could be interesting. We could use like a dirt brush. Let's use a dirt brush. You can't go wrong with a dirt brush. It has a nice grunge to it. We'll change some settings. So you can click here for pen pressure on the size and then pen pressure on the flow. And then we can actually turn down the flow a little bit so it's not as strong. And then if we try painting with this, you can actually barely see it. Let's increase it just for a second, just to make sure. Okay, it is showing up, which is very subtle. So one thing I would like to do is increase, maybe make it a little bit more yellow, just like slightly. And then let's give it a height of 0.01. So it's very subtle. Oops, just click back on this. So click on the mask. All right, so now we're painting. It has this nice little like orange thing going on. So it's a little orange. And then what we want to do, we don't want to just cover the whole thing. We just want to hit certain parts. But now that I can see it pretty easily, let's reduce the flow somewhat. Make it kind of big, and then just like touch up some spots. That's still a little extreme. Let's put the flow down to like maybe 25. Because this way you can paint on. Okay, now it's too subtle. It's always a balancing act. Alright, there is still some on there. Okay, let's try 40. Alright, that's a decent in between. And then we'll just hit up some of the parts where there's like not very many crevices, where there's just like big flat parts, just to add some color and texture to those sections. So you don't want to press down too hard, kind of like medium strength. And we can tone it down as well because we are painting with a mask. We don't want to hit every aspect of it. We just want to get like certain areas just so there's some variety. So you want to leave some of the parts essentially untouched. Now these almost look like highlights, which is fine, because these can also help transition into highlights. Like if we have like a new highlight fill layer. So try not to use them in every section. Let's try to put some in the brow. Because we're making a volcano, dude, so he has to have like some orange in him, right? I'm trying to hit like some parts that stick out, just like from before. Except now we're actually painting with a color that's kind of like a highlight. So to rotate around, Alt, and press down on the stylus. And just kind of paint in on sections where it looks kind of dull. So now it looks pretty, like a lot better, I think. Like in the face. And we can like hit up the lips. And you don't want to just paint the whole thing this color. You want to use it sparingly to some degree. Like everything shouldn't be this color. It doesn't, and also it should be like varying degrees of strength. So like the cheeks should be pretty strong, but then other parts should be pretty weak. I kind of want to do something with this area here. We'll figure that out later. And then you can add some stuff in the eye sockets, like here. Just a little bit. Then we'll hit up the sides. We will actually bring this model into Unreal Engine and Unity. I'll show that. I'll show how to export it and how to import it and everything. That'll be its own separate tutorial video, but this will all be in a row. So if you start from the beginning, you will create this in ZBrush, you will paint it in Substance, you'll import it into Unreal. So that is the idea. It's also useful to know how like to export things and to actually import them, so you know like why it needs to be a certain way. All right, so we'll save this really quick. All right, it's done saving. All right, let's hit up the sides a little bit. Now we don't want to use too much orange. Like, we want it to be mostly on the face, I want to say. So, like, another way to think of color is to, like, think of where the color belongs. So, like, the face is usually going to be compressed a lot and under tension and moves a lot. So, there would probably be, like, if this were, like, if you had a human face, there's, like, parts that are red. So, like, that's one way to think of how to add color. Now, that's not the only way, and that's not the only rule either. That's not even necessarily a rule. It's just, like, a thing you can do, like a strategy you can use. Like, okay, I'm going to try to use this on parts where it looks like it's compressed. So now instead of just randomly painting orange, you're like, all right, this part here, it's like a big chunk of this thing's flesh or goop or whatever. Let's put some orange towards this part and then kind of fade it out. That's one way to think about it. Maybe a little bit, like a dash here, a little bit here, because this part sticks out, a little bit here, because this part sticks out. Then there, it starts to make sense why colors are going where they're going, instead of just like kind of haphazardly dropping them random places. And this is the nice thing about working on sculpts and things with a lot of detail, is you can kind of simplify your process because there's already so much detail to make use of, at least in my opinion. We are not painting with symmetry on. This is symmetry. This is an asymmetrical model, so if you have a symmetrical model, you can turn on symmetry and it'll mirror your details just like in ZBrush. And you can also change the symmetry settings, so you can mirror this way, or where is it? This way. Something useful to know. Oh. So when we painted those sections up in the previous video, now we can actually paint some little highlights on those in a non-repetitive way, like in a semi-random way, so it doesn't appear to be repeating. So that way when you have these little details, they all look different. And this helps us add more asymmetry to the model, because originally this model was symmetrical, and then we made it asymmetrical in ZBrush by like tweaking some things. And you can, if you texture an asymmetrical model without symmetry on, it'll also help break up the symmetry so it looks more asymmetrical, because now the texture itself has variations in it. Let's get like these ridges here. Alright, so that's the orange, I think. So just to kind of show the difference, this is before, this is after. So it adds that little bit extra something, a little bit of extra color in there in those midtones. This is before, after. It's not as prevalent on like the sides and back. It's still there. It still adds up. Like if you have all these things, like if you had none of these things, like if you just like turned all of this off. I'm saving it right now. If you turned all of this off, then this is what you would have. So each little layer improves it just slightly, and that'll get us to our long-term result. So I would say that's the end of this one. We just added the midtones, like some midtone color. It's nice to think about it in this way because you can break it down into reproducible steps, and that's really the key, because just like with doing something like shooting a longbow, which is actually something I do, if you shoot randomly or shoot in an inconsistent way each time, your results are going to be different. And if you have at least a process that can get you from start to finish, now you could add more or less steps, like let's say you just want shadows and highlights, or you just want shadows, or maybe you want to use materials. Whatever your process is, you need some kind of process that gets you like a certain result, and then you can tweak and modify that process as you go. So that's the key thing to develop, in my opinion. But aside from that, that's pretty much it for this video. We just added the midtones, a little bit of height information, very subtle. We can actually bump it up just to see. So that's actually, this is like the effect, like if you increase it. But in this case, we'll put it at 0.03. Let's see. Maybe 0. Let's try 0.1 and see what that looks like. Alright, so that looks okay. One thing you have to watch out for, though, is if you use too much noise on everything, it starts to look crazy. So, like, this noise kind of looks like the other noise to some degree, and I feel like that's too strong, so I'll put it down to 0.05 so that there's, like, a little bit. Because, like, there's a rule, an art rule, where if everything is complicated and detailed and there's no emphasis or no simple parts, it's hard to tell what the hell you're looking at. So in the case of this design, it's very complicated in the center, but it's very simple in the eggshell. So there's kind of like a mix between complicated and simple. Same is true for color, same is true for texturing. If every part of the texture looks crazy, like if everything looks extreme, it just looks insane, and usually quite bad unless you can balance it. So it's all about a balancing act. But definitely like and subscribe if you enjoyed this or found this useful. Drop a comment, let me know what you think, and I'll see you in the next tutorial.